In the quiet suburban town of Clearwater, a picturesque neighborhood where everyone seemed to know each other's business, lived the Andersons, a family that appeared to have it all. George Anderson, a successful architect, and his wife Emily were the epitome of a perfect couple. Together they had built a comfortable life filled with family gatherings, beautiful vacations, and a charming home on Maple Drive. Yet beneath this picture-perfect surface, a secret simmered, one that would shatter everything in its wake. This is the story of Emily's affair with her brother-in-law Daniel. George and Emily had been married for 12 years. They met in college, fell in love quickly, and were inseparable ever since. George, a hard-working, dedicated man, spent long hours at his architectural firm, often traveling for work. Emily, a loving wife and mother, cared for their 2 children, a son and daughter, and managed their home with precision. She was active in the community, volunteering at the local school and organizing charity events. From the outside, they were the quintessential family, admired by everyone who knew them. But, as with many marriages, time had begun to erode their intimacy. Emily felt neglected, not just by George's long hours, but by his emotional distance. George was consumed with his career, often choosing late nights at the office or meetings with clients over time spent with her. What had once been a passionate romance had settled into a predictable routine. Their marriage, while stable, had lost the spark it once had. Emily's loneliness grew as she spent more time alone in their large house, raising their children and handling the household duties on her own. She longed for the connection and intimacy she had once shared with George, but found herself missing something even more: excitement. It was during one of George's extended work trips that Emily found herself spending more time with Daniel, George's younger brother. Daniel was in his mid-30s, ruggedly handsome and full of life. He was an artist, a free spirit who didn't conform to the rigid structure of George's professional world. Daniel had always been close to Emily, and despite their age difference, they had forged a friendship over the years. He had his own apartment in the city, but frequently visited to spend time with George and his family. Daniel, like everyone else in the family, noticed the growing distance between Emily and George. He could see the strain in Emily's eyes when they spoke, and he knew that something was wrong. One evening, after George had been gone for nearly a week on a business trip, Daniel came over to visit Emily. They sat on the back porch, sipping wine and reminiscing about old times. As the evening wore on, their conversation turned more personal. Emily, feeling isolated, opened up to Daniel about the struggles in her marriage. She spoke of the emotional disconnect between her and George, how they had grown apart over the years. Daniel listened, understanding the loneliness that came with being in a relationship that had lost its passion. As the conversation continued, the air between them shifted. There was an undeniable chemistry that had always been present, but was now magnified by the vulnerability of the moment. Emily's heart raced as Daniel leaned in, and without saying a word, he kissed her. It was unexpected, it was dangerous, but in that moment, it felt like exactly what Emily had been missing. The kiss was brief but charged with emotion, and when they pulled apart, neither of them spoke for several moments. Emily was filled with a mix of guilt and excitement, unsure of what had just transpired, but also aware of the temptation that had just opened up before her. That night, Emily lay awake, her mind racing. She loved George, but the affection and passion she craved had been missing for so long. Daniel had always been there for her in ways that George hadn't been. The next few days passed in a blur as Emily tried to return to normalcy, but she couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward Daniel. Soon they found themselves spending more time together, each encounter more intimate than the last. At first it was subtle, a lingering touch, a heated glance, but soon their physical attraction became undeniable. They met in secret, in quiet corners of the house, when George was at work or when the kids were at school. It wasn't just physical, There was an emotional connection that grew between them, one that Emily hadn't expected. They would meet in the evenings when George was away, sharing stolen moments of passion and desire. The thrill of being caught added to the intensity, but so did the overwhelming guilt. Emily knew what she was doing was wrong, that the consequences of her actions could destroy everything, her marriage, her family, and her reputation. But at the same time, it felt so right. Daniel made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the affair deepened, so did the tension. Emily struggled with her conscience, torn between her love for George and the undeniable connection she shared with Daniel. Every time George returned from a trip, Emily would slip back into the role of the dutiful wife, pretending that everything was normal. But behind closed doors, she was hiding a secret that was growing harder and harder to conceal. George, ever busy with his career, didn't notice the subtle changes at first. He was preoccupied with work and was often out of town. But as time went on, he began to sense something was off. Emily's moods became unpredictable, and she would often seem distracted or distant when he tried to engage her. He chalked it up to the pressures of raising children and maintaining the household. But what George couldn't ignore were the small things. The way Emily's eyes darted nervously when Daniel was around, or the way she became defensive when he mentioned spending time with his brother. The cracks in their marriage were beginning to show. One evening, after a particularly heated argument about their lack of intimacy, George left the house to clear his head. He decided to go to the local bar, something he hadn't done in years. As he sat there, nursing a drink, his mind wandered back to the strange behavior he had noticed in Emily. In that moment, a thought began to take shape. What if she was having an affair? The idea shocked him, but it also made sense, and his suspicions turned to Daniel. George's fears were confirmed one evening when he returned home earlier than expected. The house was quiet, but he noticed something odd. The door to the study, which Emily always kept locked, was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. What he found was enough to stop his heart. There on the couch were Emily and Daniel, caught in the act. They froze, their faces pale with shock and guilt. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence before George finally spoke, his voice low and trembling. "I never thought you'd do this," he said, his words breaking the stillness. "With my brother?" Emily, her face flushed with shame, could only manage a few words of apology. Daniel, equally stunned, stood up, unable to look George in the eye. There were no more words to be said. The damage had been done. The fallout from the affair was swift and unforgiving. George left the house that night, devastated and heartbroken. Emily was left alone, grappling with the consequences of her actions. She had betrayed the man she loved, her children, and her entire family. The affair with Daniel had destroyed everything she had worked for. George filed for divorce, and the once idyllic home on Maple Drive was sold. Emily, deeply remorseful for her actions, tried to rebuild her life. She cut ties with Daniel, who also disappeared from the scene, ashamed of what had transpired. As the months passed, Emily began to understand the depth of the damage she had caused. Her relationship with her children had become strained, and her reputation in the community was forever tarnished. But the guilt that weighed on her was the hardest burden to bear. In the end, Emily's affair with her brother-in-law was a reminder of the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of betrayal. What began as a fleeting moment of passion and temptation ended up destroying the life she had built, leaving behind a trail of heartbreak and regret.